By the early 1770s, the British East India Company had aggressively swallowed vast territories across Bengal, but this expansion was dangerously uncoordinated. Revenue collection, the lifeblood of the company, was fractured. It relied on autonomous English collectors stationed deep in the Mofussil, the rural interior, operating miles away from any real oversight. These men effectively ruled as local tyrants. Instead of securing the company's tax base, they prioritized their own private trading empires, monopolizing local goods and draining the regional economy into their own pockets. This internal bleed triggered a crisis in London. Look at this general letter from April 1773. The Court of Directors explicitly ordered the English collectors to be withdrawn from the interior, pulling the plug on these agents due to their massive abuses of power. The East India Company realized its primary existential threat wasn't a rival military or a local uprising. It was its own corrupt, decentralized administrators bankrupting the system from within. Governor Warren Hastings convened the Board of Revenue on November 23, 1773, to engineer a way out of this administrative collapse. Hastings recognized that corporate survival required ending reliance on autonomous individuals. The company needed to build an impersonal, centralized bureaucratic machine. His resulting blueprint rested on three structural pillars: centralizing revenue collection, overhauling criminal justice, and bureaucratizing social law. These regulations functioned as the foundational engineering of a sovereign colonial state. While framed as a temporary fix, the logic of centralization designed in that boardroom established the structural basis for British administrative control. The first step was physically mapping the territory to establish direct lines of control. The pre-existing geography of Bengal, seen here in Rennell's survey, was vast and highly complex. Hastings simplified this map into 5 strict provincial councils: Murshidabad, Burdwan, Dinajpur, Dhaka, and Calcutta. Each district was overseen by a chief and senior servants. This created a rigid hierarchy where financial data and administrative authority converged directly on a central node in Calcutta. For sub-districts too remote for these main councils to manage directly, Hastings appointed a diwan or naive to act as a subordinate manager, keeping the chain of command unbroken. Creating 5 powerful regional councils raised an obvious risk. How would the company stop these new chiefs from simply becoming the next generation of corrupt tyrants? Hastings implemented strict interdictions. Look at point number 6. It explicitly forbids company servants from purchasing or selling articles in the districts, banning them from private trade in essential commodities. To ensure compliance with this ban, the company provided a monthly gratuity of 3,000 rupees, funded entirely by the profits of the company's newly expanding opium trade. Even with these councils established, regional autonomy was not the goal. The councils were designed as a stepping stone to eventually process all detail of collections directly out of the Calcutta headquarters. Hastings remapped the territory to establish a closed, frictionless circuit for wealth extraction. Extracting the wealth was only half the problem. The company also had to secure that revenue against internal, violent disruption. Out in the rural interior, the primary physical threats were dacoits, organized bands of robbers who routinely ambushed tax shipments and terrified local farmers into withholding their rents. Hastings realized that the existing indigenous legal system, specifically the Mohammedan criminal courts, was structurally incapable of protecting the company's assets. He had to bypass it entirely. The clash was philosophical. Hastings demanded a state-enforced public order, while Mohammedan law often viewed violent crime as a matter of interpersonal dispute and private restitution.
Hastings cataloged the systemic friction this caused. He noted that if a murder had been perpetrated by means of an instrument not designed for shedding blood, the court often ruled that the intention to kill was not proved, and only a fine was inflicted. He pointed to a second obstacle. The law allowed the privilege to the nearest of kin to a murdered person to pardon the murderer, usually in exchange for blood money. This horrified the British administrators. Treating murder as a private civil negotiation ignored the European concept of a crime committed against the overarching authority of the state. To override these local courts, Hastings proposed a new structural solution. In April 1774, he declared that Faujdars should be appointed for the protection of the inhabitants, for the detection and apprehension of public robbers. The company drew strict police station boundaries, known as thanas. They gave the Faujdars absolute command over local land servants, overriding the traditional authority of the indigenous zemindars. Restorative local justice was replaced by a punitive, centralized police force designed specifically to guard the company's revenue. Hastings then turned this new bureaucratic machinery towards social control, focusing initially on major urban hubs like Calcutta and Dhaka. He targeted the chaotic regional slave trade, a pervasive system across Bengal that was then being exacerbated by child theft and kidnapping. Issuing a sudden military ban on slavery risked triggering a massive social revolt among local elites. Instead, the company decided to choke the institution using administrative friction. In July 1774, they issued new regulations. Examine Point 10. It mandated that no slave could be legally purchased without a registered kawabala or deed, validated by an official magistrate. The rule was absolute. Any person attempting to buy or sell a slave after July 1st without this specific paperwork saw the sale invalidated, and any official granting deeds illegally was summarily dismissed. By introducing this single piece of required paperwork, Hastings shifted massive leverage away from traditional social hierarchies. Authority now sat directly in the hands of the company's record keepers. But the most radical long-term intervention was buried in Regulation 24. This regulation aimed to break the generational cycle of bondage. It declared that the right of masters to the children of their slaves could not and ought not to extend further than the first generation. Hastings proved that the ledger and the registry could dismantle indigenous social structures far more effectively than a standing army. The revenue councils, the Faujdari police, and the social registries. By plotting tax boundaries and weaving mandatory paperwork through everyday life, Hastings locked Bengal into a rigid, interconnected grid of control. To transition from a trading enterprise into a sovereign empire, the East India Company had to systematically eliminate autonomous, localized rule and replace it with impersonal, centralized systems. Building this machine required a dual offensive, stripping away the unchecked power of rogue British collectors, while simultaneously eroding the authority of traditional indigenous zemindars. Ironically, by 1781, Hastings formally abolished these provincial councils, originally devised as temporary. They were dismantled because they achieved their goal, ensuring all the collections of the provinces should be brought down to the presidency and be there administered. The physical councils disappeared, but the logic of routing all data, justice, and authority strictly into Calcutta became permanent. The East India Company had discovered a mechanism of rule that compounded in strength with every new form, deed, and regulation. Ultimately, the 1773 regulations proved that the relentless, calculated power of the bureaucrat was the primary engine of early British colonialism.
In the early 1770s, the British East India Company was struggling to control a chaotic, decentralized Bengal. To impose strict order, Governor Warren Hastings unleashed 3 sweeping administrative overhauls that changed India forever. First up, centralizing the money. Hastings pulled local English tax collectors out of the rural interior and replaced them with 5 massive regional hubs designed to funnel wealth directly into Calcutta, the provincial councils. Second, overhauling criminal justice. The region was plagued by heavily armed bandit gangs known as dacoits. Hastings was frustrated by local Islamic laws that allowed murderers to simply pay blood money to victims' families. So he bypassed the courts, deploying 14 specialized police stations dedicated entirely to hunting down robbers, known as Faujdars. And finally, strict social regulation. To combat a rampant child kidnapping market in 1774 Calcutta, the government outlawed the creation of any new slaves and required a registered deed for existing ones. It was an attempt to choke out the black market without fully abolishing the institution. By centralizing the money, militarizing the police, and registering the population, Hastings transformed a loose corporate footprint into a rigid colonial state.